Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal and government correspondent, and it is an election year, and we are here now in mid-September with an election coming up on November 8th. And the candidate that we have with us today is Representative Tom Tiffany. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Jamie, it's really good to join you again.
Well, and thanks for coming live. I know that you have a very busy schedule and everything, so I'm glad we were able to get you before you head back to Washington. So obviously, we just alluded to the fact that you're already in the office and you're seeking re-election. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Elected in a special election to succeed Sean Duffy in May of 2020 and won re-election in November of 2020, finishing my first full term.
Okay. And so this, we were just talking off camera about the district, some slight changes with I'm trying to remember which census it was. Was it 2010, I think, census that switched the St. Croix County from the 3rd to the 7th, and some other counties that were on the border went down into 3rd. But basically, your district comprises geographically what?
So for those people familiar with east of here, it runs all the way from Florence to Antigo, down to Wausau, kind of diagonally across northeastern Wisconsin to Wausau, Wausau over to Marshfield, a sliver that goes further south down towards Nakusa, but basically then Marshfield over to Hudson, everything north. It actually covers 40% of the land mass of Wisconsin. 8 congressional districts. Wow. I get 40% of the land mass that I represent, and but it's a great part of the state, largely rural, and yeah, it's just a terrific part of the state.
Now, with the 2020 census, I know in some of our state races for Assembly and Senate that changed some boundaries. Yours didn't significantly change with this latest census?
Yeah, that's right. With the least changes approach that was taken, this 7th Congressional, which this is, it changed very little. I mean, it was just minute. I think we had to pick up like 5,000 people to meet the census requirement for the minimum amount of population. But yeah, very little changes that were made.
Okay. And the Florence you referenced, that's way over on the Michigan border?
Yeah, way up by Iron Mountain, up on
all right.
the Upper Peninsula border.
Right. So anyway, geographically, that's what we have. And historically, the seat, I go back, to my
and
college.
by the way, to repeat, I live in, or to mention this, I live in Minocqua, which is far north central Wisconsin. So right. That is my home base. People oftentimes ask that question.
Okay, so Minocqua is where you're out of. And, because this is, I think, only your second appearance on the show, we had the special election / general election both in 2020. But why don't you tell the folks a little bit about your background, why you ran in the first place?
Yeah, so I grew up right here in western Wisconsin. Grew up in a little town, Elmwood, not far from here.
Okay.
Grew up on a dairy farm, 7 brothers and sisters, all live in this region yet. And went to college at UW River Falls, got an agricultural economics degree. Ended up spending 7.5 years using that degree down in southern Minnesota, Plainview, Minnesota, near Rochester. And then the company I was with wanted me to move further west, and I said, I come from the hills and valleys of western Wisconsin. I'm going back to Wisconsin. Ended up in Minocqua about 30 years ago. Met my wife there. And we owned and managed a dinner and excursion boat, Wilderness Cruises, for 20 years. We have 3 daughters, all have graduated now. We just became empty nesters.
Okay.
And I came into the legislature in 2010 in the state assembly, served there for 2 years, went to the state senate for nearly 8 years, and then was elected in the special election to serve in Congress. But yeah, really deep roots here in western Wisconsin.
Okay, so small businessman, as you mentioned, up there in the Minocqua area for 20 years, and then in government politics since 2010.
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. So with that, we've got, you have a different opponent than you faced in your first 2 elections, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And I don't know much about your opponent. We won't spend time talking about candidate things, but just mainly where are you, what would you say your pitch is for being reelected? What have you gotten done or accomplished in the last 2 years that you want to build upon?
So starting out right after the special election, when we had the COVID emergency that was going on, we were able to get a number of agricultural producers, including ginseng farmers, qualified for the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. It was a dire time with the country being shut down, and we were able to help some of those people be able to stay on their feet. Since then, as far as in the district, I mean, we spent a fair amount of time up in the Twin Ports, Superior and Duluth. That is such an important port on Lake Superior, have been able to be helpful to them. Myself and Representative Stauber from Duluth, we're working diligently. We haven't accomplished it yet, but we're trying to get them eligible for contracts, or I should say military contracts, and worked diligently at that. There's also some serious rail issues across the northern part of the state that we've been working on also, where Canadian National has really not been the best neighbor here in Wisconsin as far as getting good rates and good service for those rail customers. And so those are a couple issues that we've been working on. Other than that, it's been those bigger issues that surround the border. I spent a lot of time on that issue: border crime, inflation, energy, natural resources, those type of things that I've been working on. I sit on the Judiciary Committee and the Natural Resources Committee, and worked very diligently on those committees. The tech issues are really big in the Judiciary Committee. Border issues are in our bailiwick in the Judiciary Committee. Spent a lot of time on those issues, on natural resources and forestry, mining, all those natural resources issues we spent a lot of time on.
Okay. Well, let's take the first one, border. You've mentioned that a couple times. What do you see being able to address this? It's almost as if neither side wants to propose something that works, and the problem is just allowed to kind of fester. So what things would you like to see done if you're reelected?
Yeah, for sure. So my first trip that I took after being elected in May of 2020, I went down to Arizona, went down to the southern border, met with local sheriffs down there to see what was happening. And they were really talking about the success that they were having as far as limiting the number of people that were coming in illegally. And so this would have been under the previous administration. You fast forward, I made another trip then early April of 2021, right after the Biden administration had removed Remain in Mexico and had adopted catch and release. The border was already beginning to get out of control just within a couple months. And since then, we've seen millions of people come into this country illegally. And something needs to be done about it, because it's not just that people are coming in illegally, and it's a national security problem, which I believe is the number one danger of having an open border, is national security. But we also see fentanyl that is all over the country. Every state is now a border state. For the first time in history, we had over 100,000 overdose deaths in America, and that's largely because the fentanyl is just rolling in across that southern border, because those Border Patrol agents are basically just babysitters at this point, transiting people into this country illegally, as instructed by the Biden administration. And they're not able to do their job of interdicting those drugs, interdicting those people that may be a national security threat. They're not able to spend the time doing that they should. And of course, the human trafficking. I mean, I have regularly said, for people that have been following what I say as the congressional representative for the 7th, that the Biden administration has really turned our government into is complicitly responsible for creating one of the largest human trafficking operations in the history of the world. And all you have to do is look at the 53 migrants that were fried to death in the back of a semi-trailer in San Antonio, Texas earlier this year. It is completely out of control. And it's not that hard to fix it, because that's one of the things when we talk about the broader question, okay, what have you accomplished? What are you looking at doing? We know what the problems are, and the border is one of the problems. It is a matter of how we fix it. And how we fix it is not that hard down on the border. We can reinstate Remain in Mexico. In order to have your asylum hearing, you have to stay in Mexico to get it. That discourages people from coming to our country illegally. Restart construction of the border wall, which has been proven to be successful. Meeting with those sheriffs down in Arizona 2 years ago, they said, the wall isn't the only thing that will keep people out, but it really helps us. And then the third thing is stop, catch, and release. And catch and release is exactly as it's described. You catch people, and that's what the Border Patrol agents do. I've seen it happen, and they just release them into the country. All we have to do is reverse those things, and that will go a long way towards controlling what's happening at our border.
Okay, so as opposed to catch and release, what would your proposal be? Catch and return, or what? Catch and just keep? What would they do? You talked about interdicting, so how would they do their job?
Sure. So yes, I do think that you can do catch and return, but what's being forgotten here is that on January 20th of 2021, when President Biden said, we're going to open the border, green light, anyone can come to our country that wants to, we're going to let you in. And we'll deal with all the immigration stuff later. That's basically what the message was. That was the green light for people to come from all over the world. I was down to the Yuma sector earlier this year. People from over 100 countries have come in through that Yuma sector. Many people think it's just the Northern Triangle countries in Mexico where people are coming from. No, they're coming from all over the world, and there's some bad actors, as in terrorist background people, that are coming into our country. And if you stop, catch, and release, that puts up the red light then for the rest of the world to see that, hold it, if you're going to come here, you better have a legitimate asylum claim, and you need to get in line in order to have your immigration hearing held. And that's one of the real unfortunate things with the Biden policies, is that those who have legitimate asylum claims or people that are trying to get into the country legally, these people are getting in front of them. And that's not how our immigration system should work. It just takes the will to do it, and this can be turned around, because we saw it a couple years ago where the numbers had dropped precipitously.
And how did they measure that the numbers were dropping?
Those all come from the Border Patrol.
Okay.
The Border Patrol, Department of Homeland Security, they generate those numbers.
So if they see people crossing or they take custody of them, then they get added to a statistic.
Sure, and they have cameras, stuff like that. They're able to track people in that way. I mean, one of the things, so we know millions of people that have come in illegally, but that doesn't even include the gotaways. There's estimates we may have as many as 1 million gotaways in just a little over a year and a half have come into the United States, and they're not even accounted for.
Okay. So what about the people that are willing to get in line, as you said it, that may have legitimate, what's the word I'm looking for, the protection of the government and so forth?
A legitimate claim
yes.
to come into our country.
Right. If they do, what? Because my understanding is that those hearings were basically, reduced greatly. Do you think that part of the solution would be to get the people that have legitimate claims and get in line properly, get their claims processed?
Yes, and if you take a look at the Remain in Mexico policy, what that did is if someone came to the country and they claimed asylum, you want to make sure that it's a legitimate claim, correct?
Right.
And so what they said is you got to remain in Mexico in order to have that asylum claim. Now the way it works is people are allowed just to come in, and they're said, be sure to come in and make your asylum claim at some point. How many people do that? Very few people that come into our country illegally do that. So it's very important to make sure that those claims are made at the border, and people are not allowed into the United States until they fulfill that commitment. So I do believe that we should have a reasonable immigration system that allows people to be able to come into our country, but our immigration system should serve the interest of America. At this point, it doesn't. It's an open border policy. We're basically a borderless America at this point. And that brings real problems with it, as I talked about, national security concerns with terrorists coming into our country. Also, the drugs coming in. I mean, and the fentanyl stuff now at this point really isn't overdoses, it's poisonings that is happening where China and Mexico, with their system, they are pumping this fentanyl into our country, and it's absolutely deadly. When you hear those stories, it's heartbreaking to hear what's happening. We have to bring our border under control.
So next up, crime, you had mentioned. So what can you do in Congress on a federal level about state crimes, because 95% of the violent crime are state statutes, not federal. So what would you propose for changes in our criminal system on the federal level?
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct. It's largely a state function, and I believe it should stay that way. But I do believe there are ways in which the federal government can help. So for those federalized crimes that we have, myself and Senator Grassley from Iowa are just introducing a bill to combat violent crime, to make sure that those people that are committing those violent crimes, carjackings, rapes, things like that, that they actually are charged appropriately for the harm that they're doing to those victims. So that bill we have just released now.
And just how does that work? Because I'm a former prosecutor in Eau Claire County, and I was just curious, how does the federal government ensure that an assistant DA in St. Croix County or Eau Claire County is properly charging a violent crime?
So it would be under federal statute, and they would have to follow that federal statute.
Okay.
That would be a requirement. Another thing that we introduced was prosecutors should prosecute. What we're seeing is some of the woke prosecutors across the country. We have one right in Milwaukee County here in Wisconsin. They have not been charging people, been low bail or no bail, letting people off with a slap on the wrist. Some that are on their third, fourth, fifth offenses, committing violent crimes. This bill requires a report from prosecutors if they're not prosecuting appropriately those people that are committing violent crimes. And so we want to see that data from the states to see who's actually doing their jobs. And we're seeing in many cities that they're not. And for example, the district attorney in San Francisco that got recalled recently because he didn't charge.
Sure, and that was a
crimes.
local effort, but how does the federal government, typically Republicans are not for making federal government bigger and leave decisions to the states. So what is it that Wisconsin, that has a Republican House and Senate, what are they doing wrong with regard to crimes?
I think it's people saying we want responsibility taken for the violent crime that has increased so seriously across our country. People are saying we want to know why this continues because we want to bring it under control. And we're saying, like in my role on the Judiciary Committee, we're saying then there needs to be accountability. And we are going to get that. And I think getting those reports, like those prosecutors who are not charging crime as they should be, I think can help us, and we can also expose it back to the states. But you are correct that it is best if we leave it largely as a state function, but there are existing statutes in regards to certain violent crimes, and we want to make sure that those statutes are upheld.
Okay. So you mentioned the environment, and what is it, would there be a change, or is it enforce the laws we have? What is it that you would like to see in that area?
Yeah, make sure the laws that are there are enforced. I mean, take the example of the Waukesha Christmas Parade last year. That terrible killing that went down there when a repeat offender killed 6 people driving through the parade, injured dozens. He was out on very low bail. I mean, he had a history of violent crime. In that district attorney's office in Milwaukee County, they were letting him off with a slap on the wrist. They need to make sure that violent criminals are charged appropriately and that they're not a menace to society. 6 people are dead as a result of the low bail that John Chisholm, the Milwaukee district attorney, charged in that case. And by the way, if you go back and look at District Attorney Chisholm's statements from 2007, when he said, we're going to change how we go about doing this, and you know what? Are some people going to die as a result of it? And that was his words. I'm paraphrasing to a certain extent, but he said, will some people die as a result of the change of how I go about adjudicating these crimes? Absolutely. That was his answer. 6 people in Waukesha County paid the price with their lives as a result of him not doing his job.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I pivoted on you and maybe I didn't emphasize, but I was talking specifically about the environment because you had mentioned environment and stuff, and I know that crime was your
I'll
talking
follow.
point
I'll
right
follow
after the
along
board.
this time, Jamie.
All right, all right. Well, but I mean, let's just follow up with that. So how about if we start, for these companies that are polluting our environment and killing people, are we going to start prosecuting those people and get them accountable for what they're doing?
Yeah, I believe that when you take a look at the big picture in terms of the environment in the United States, we have made such great strides over the last 4 to 5 decades. Do we have challenges yet? Absolutely. There are things that need to be done. And those that pollute intentionally and harm the environment, they should be charged appropriately. Every state has a Department of Natural Resources that takes care of those situations. They should be charged appropriately. But for example, when you look at power plants, sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide are down more than 80% since 1990. I mean, it is a great success story here in America of how we've been able to protect the environment. And the big thing that I'm concerned about, when I was a kid growing up in Elmwood, we used to be taught in school that in the Sierra Club would come out regularly and say, you know, think locally, act globally. Or, excuse me, think globally, act locally, right?
Right.
I mean, that's what they would always say. Well, we need to think about that now because we've outsourced many of our industrial plants and things like that to places like China, India, and others that do not have the same environmental standards that we have. And for example, you look at mining. I believe we should be doing more of that here in the United States because the countries where we are getting those mined products, they don't have the environmental standards we have. They do not have the labor standards that we have. Many of them use child labor in Africa. China is one of the worst polluters that you'll find on the planet. And we should produce some of those things, some of those raw materials here in the United States where we have some of the strongest, tightest environmental protections in place.
So you're not advocating relaxing the environmental protections, just doing something to get them to start operating in this country under those protections.
That is correct. We do not have to relax our environmental standards. You just have to allow companies to be able to go through the permitting process in an appropriate amount of time. I mean, one of the things that I would like to see change is we're seeing permits sometimes taking 15 to 20 years to be completed. You wonder why some bridges don't get done. You wonder why some of the infrastructure things don't get done on a timely basis. It's because of that permitting process, especially from the federal level. And what we should do is set those standards, make them strong like we have in America, but then allow them, a company seeking that permit to be able to do that in a timely fashion. You know, allow them to be able to do it in 2, 3, 4, 5 years rather than this 15 to 20 years, which is delaying some of our infrastructure projects we'd like to complete.
Well, you mentioned about the other countries, and they have more lax standards, and they're contributing to carbon dioxide at a greater rate than our country is. So what can be done to encourage, because we need to bring more manufacturing back to this country. Our last supply chain issues over the last 3 years have kind of taught us that. We need to start making computer chips here and so forth. So what is being done at the federal level, or what can be done to try and incentivize businesses for doing business within our country as opposed to having plants in these other countries?
Yeah.
And exporting American jobs?
So we've had a Democrat-controlled Congress for this session of Congress, and of course President Biden as the president, and they really haven't done anything to bring them back to America. And because it requires changing those permitting processes. In particular, there's the NEPA process, an acronym for one of the environmental programs. And there needs to be changes to some of those permitting requirements in order for some of these companies to be able to produce in America. And until we change that, they're going to continue to go to other countries to produce those, especially raw materials. It's great to have the manufacturing. We would have more manufacturing if we produce those raw materials, whether it's our forest products, which we grow more trees here in Wisconsin than we cut. We have the mining resources, and of course, you look at the Iron Range in northern Minnesota. We have those mineral resources to be able to create those, to create the iron, steel, and things like that that we make into all those goods that we use every day. And if we would change some of those things, then you would see those manufacturers come back to America, I believe.
Okay, exploring these other issues. Now, first of all, you mentioned the committees that you're on, and you said judiciary, and the other one was?
Natural resources.
Natural resources, so that's what we were just talking about. Now, would you see yourself seeking a change in the committees that you're appointed to now that you got a little bit more seniority if you get reelected to another term?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Actually, I really like the committees that I'm on. Judiciary, we deal with, of course, crime issues. We deal with the border issue. I think two of the biggest issues that are before all of us in the Congress at this point. But we also deal with the big tech issues. And there's really deep concerns, I think, with big tech and the control they have over our economy at this point. And I think there's some stuff there, especially, and I actually think that that may be a place where we can get some bipartisan agreement that the big tech companies are too big, too controlling at this point, and that there needs to be some accountability there. So lots of action there, and that's why I signed up for this job. So I'll certainly want to stay on judiciary, and I will want to stay on natural resources also, because that's an area that I've done a lot of work, and especially with the forest products industry in the 7th Congressional District being such a big part of this district, that's certainly a place that I'm going to want to stay.
Okay. There's two areas that I would be remiss if I didn't ask you because they've been a big deal in the last 6 months. And one is, the abortion issue with Roe v. Wade being reversed by the Dobbs decision, and now Lindsey Graham talking about having a national delineation point in which the states don't have control over it after 15 weeks. It would be just basically a federal ban. Where would you stand with taking up that cause in the next 2 years?
Yeah, I believe it's a state issue. And so first of all, for all of our viewers out there, I'm pro-life. I believe we should protect life whenever and however that we can. And it has really concerned me that we have had votes in Congress here over the last few months since the Dobbs decision where every Democrat has voted for unlimited abortions, 3rd trimester, partial birth abortion.
I'm sorry, where is this that every Democrat has voted for that?
Every Democrat in both the House and the Senate has voted for unlimited abortions. We have the votes, they're on record. That's barbaric. I think there's a much better way to do this. And for example, here in Wisconsin, when I was in the legislature 5-6 years ago, we passed a 20-week ban. And so in other words, after 20 weeks, it would ban abortions. And when you think about the medical technology that we have these days, we save babies' lives all the time after 20 weeks. I think that very much made sense to do it that way. And I certainly stand by my vote. Now, I think one thing that people forget, and I urge people to read the decision. It was written by Justice Alito. What he did was he said that we're overturning a case, overturning Roe versus Wade, where 9 judges made that decision, not your elected representatives, as should have, because it is not contained in the Constitution that you have a right to an abortion. He said it was decided illegitimately by those 9 judges. We need to return it to the people and their representatives. And now that's what's happened. Now people are going to be able to decide what they want to do. And while I don't agree, like in New York, where they said, yes, we're going to allow unlimited abortions up to 9 months of pregnancy. I don't agree with that at all. But that's what the people of New York
Well, how about the
chose.
other end? When you say pro-life, again, people debate how pro-life. So are you against all abortions, even ones in the case of rape, incest, and life of the mother at risk?
Yeah, so if you look at, for example, the 20-week bill that we passed when I was in the state legislature 5-6 years ago, there was an exception for the life of the mother in there. And I believe, I'd have to double check this, but I believe there's also an exception for rape and incest. So,
So there could be exceptions. What about, and then even further with, as far as pro-life, contraceptive, are you against contraception, the Plan B method of contraception, which is stopping the, fertilized egg from implanting in the, in the uterus?
yeah, I'm not opposed to contraception.
Okay, all right. That clarifies that. And then finally, the election, deal. We've had, the current Congress talking about January 6th for, a year and a half now. It'll be 2 years in January. But then in January, there may be a new Congress. So will the new Congress be stopping, the look into January 6th, but instead making efforts to try and revisit the election and have a redo or install President Trump back to office?
I don't know how that can be done under the Constitution as it's written. I don't see how they could be done. But I mean, take a look at the January 6th Commission. So it isn't that I'm so much opposed to the January 6th Commission. It's just that Speaker Pelosi did it on her terms. Mm-hmm. She's not giving a full accounting of it. We're not hearing all the information that come out. Many people don't realize that Speaker Pelosi's communications on January 6th, they're off limits. Some of the FBI informants that were in the audio, who may have been in the crowd January 6th, they're off limits. Put all the information on the table. I believe the American people are very fair-minded about this. If you give them all of the information that was generated and let them see what happened on that day, but that's not what the January 6th Commission has done. They have cherry-picked the information that they want. And it's kind of this shiny ball at this point, and you'll continue to see this play out up until the election. And I believe that's what President Biden did with his speech in Philadelphia also, with that eerie red background in him, where he basically said half the country are semi-fascist. I mean, it was as unpresidential as I've seen a president be. And to me, that's all about that shiny ball to distract us, to distract the voters from inflation, rising energy prices, the border. President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, they don't want the American people talking about the policies they've passed in this session of the Congress that have led to America being weakened.
Okay. With that, I see that we're done with our time. I'm sorry. We could probably talk for another half hour. But sure. I want to thank you for coming and sharing with us what your priorities would be. The election is November 8th. And if people want more information, where do they get that?
Yeah, just go to tomtiffany.com. That's where you'll find my campaign side. If you want to look at bills that I've introduced or look at my legislative record in more detail, go to tiffany.house.gov. And I would say the most important thing in closing here, we all know what the problems are. We need to provide solutions, and that's what we're going to do. If we get the majority back in the House of Representatives as Republicans, we're going to provide solutions to these problems that are facing the American people as it's been weakened over the last year and a half.
All right. With that, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank our viewers for watching another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson. Keep watching.